Hey, what's up, Marcus? Bro, I really appreciate everything you had to say about Nadella, his leadership style, and how he's transformed Microsoft. I haven't really followed a lot of what's been going on with that company. Even though I'm a gamer, I'm a big fan of the Xbox. However, my PlayStation has been getting more of my time, and that might change in light of your talk today, though. But I really appreciated how you highlighted how he balances empathy and innovation, which I think is just a huge tension to manage, especially if you're leading a company like Microsoft. So I think he really does embody what Daft calls a strategist in chief by creating that strategic clarity and the cultural renewal, stepping into what was a toxic environment. And so, to your question about whether strategic leadership requires, I believe you said, cultural transformation, or can the strategy just impact the organization without changing the culture? I'd say in most cases, and I actually got this from our reading, strategy and culture are inseparable. Daft argues that the strategist in chief not only sets direction, but also aligns systems, people, values with that direction. And so all of those are cultural things. I think without a cultural shift, strategy often becomes just a list of documents and policies instead of a movement. Um, I remember Pastor Michael also saying, culture eats strategy for lunch. And so Nadella himself, I found a quote of him saying that culture is everything. And so a lot of the transformation that we've seen happen at Microsoft has been because of his emphasis on culture. It's not just he has the company and a brilliant strategy on paper, because that's what Microsoft was. Everything looked good on the outside, but internally, the culture is what was toxic. It was competitive, it killed collaboration, and I think his emphasis on empathy, it wasn't just a soft skill move. That was the strategic move. The empathy that he emphasizes created a cultural shift, and that became the delivery system for his strategy. From a biblical standpoint, Jesus obviously modeled and taught this principle in Mark 10:42. He defined leadership culture for us. The disciples are arguing about who's the best, who's the greatest, and Jesus says, who would ever be great among you must be your servant. And so this is the cultural transformation within the disciples' mindset. Once they realize they're not supposed to lord over one another like the Gentiles, the strategy for advancing the kingdom, making disciples of all nations, requires a completely new cultural servant leadership model. Scholars like Edgar Stein, and organizational culture and leadership note that the strategic change always involves unfreezing and reshaping deep cultural assumptions. So you can't sustain a new strategy with an old culture. It's kind of like the whole new wine, old wineskins kind of tension. Practically, I think in ministry context, for me, this really hits home because I've rolled out a lot of strategic plans. Sometimes I can be a little bit of a good idea fairy, new programs, new structures, new goals, new vision, right? But I've had to go at the pace that the church in Newport News embraced a culture. Our culture had to embody humility and faith and unity. Without those things, I don't believe any of our strategies would bear any fruit. And so some language that we've started using is we do teams on purpose. Again, God made you on purpose for a purpose. And so I wanted to remove the barrier, the assumption that some people have about serve teams is we're just trying to mobilize some volunteers. No, we're trying to release people into their ministries. We're trying to disciple people. So we do teams on purpose. It's not just a slogan. It became a culture shaping strategy. And so, again, to your question, just want to summarize things. I believe strategy requires cultural transformation. Culture is what gives strategy the oxygen it needs to breathe. Thanks for the question. Looking forward to hearing your responses.